The Incredible Journey, Chapter 4. Chapter 4. Hunger was now the ruling instinct in the Labrador, and it drove him to forage in the early dawn. Excuse me. He was desperate enough to try some deer droppings, but spat them out immediately in disgust. While he was drinking from a marsh pool still covered with lily pads, he saw a frog staring at him with goggle eyes from a small stone. Measuring the distance carefully, he sprang and caught it in the air as it leaped to safety. It disappeared down his throat in one crunch, and he looked around happily for more. But an hour's patient search rewarded him with only 2, so he returned to his companions. They had apparently eaten, for there were feathers and fur scattered around, and both were licking their lips. But something warned him not to urge his old companions on. The terrier was still utterly exhausted, and in addition had lost a lot of blood from the gashes suffered at the cub's claws the day before. These were stiff and black with blood, and had a tendency to open and bleed slightly with any movement. So all that day he lay peacefully in the warm fall sunshine on the grass, sleeping, eating what the cat provided, and wagging his tail whenever one of the others came near. The young dog spent most of the day still occupied with his ceaseless foraging for food. By evening he was desperate, but his luck turned when a rabbit, already changing to its white winter coat, suddenly started up from the long grass and swerved across his path. Head down, tail flying, the young dog gave chase, swerving and turning in pursuit, but always the rabbit was just out of reach of his hungry jaws. At last he put all his strength into one violent lunge and felt the warm, pulsating prize in his mouth. The generations fell away, and the years of training never to sink teeth into feathers or fur. For a moment the Labrador looked almost wolf-like as he tore at the warm flesh and bolted it down in ravenous gulps. They slept in the same place that night and most of the following day, and the weather mercifully continued warm and sunny. By the 3rd day, the old dog seemed almost recovered and the wounds were closed. He had spent most of the day ambling around and sleeping, so that by now he seemed almost frisky and quite eager to walk a little. So, in the late afternoon, they left the place which had been their home for 3 days and trotted slowly along the track together again. By the time the moon rose, they had traveled several miles, and they had come to the edge of a small lake which the track skirted. A moose was standing in the water among the lily pads on the far shore, his great antlered head and humped neck silhouetted clearly against the pale moon. He took no notice of the strange animals across the water, but thrust his head again and again under the water, raising it high in the air after each immersion and arching his neck. 2 or 3 water hens swam out from the reeds. A little crested grebe popped up like a jack-in-the-box in the water beside them, and the spreading ripples of their wake caught the light of the moon. As the 3 sat, ears pricked, they watched the moose squelch slowly out of the muddy water, shake himself, and turn, cantering up the bank out of sight. The young dog turned his head suddenly, his nose twitching, for his keen scent had caught a distant whiff of wood smoke and of something else, something unidentifiable. Seconds later, the old dog caught the scent too and started to his feet, snuffing and questioning with his nose. His thin, whippy tail began to sweep to and fro, and a bright gleam appeared in the slanted black currant eyes. Somewhere, not too far away, were human beings, his world. He could not mistake their message or refuse their invitation. They were undoubtedly cooking something. He trotted off determinedly in the direction of the tantalizing smell. The young dog followed somewhat reluctantly, and for once the cat passed them both, a little moon-mad perhaps, for he lay in wait to dart and strike, then streaked back into the shadows, only to reappear a second later in an elaborate stalk of their tails. Both dogs ignored him. The scent on the evening breeze was a fragrant compound of roasting rice, wild duck stew, and wood smoke. When the animals looked down from a hill, tantalized and hungry, they saw 6 or 7 fires in the clearing below, their flames lighting up a semicircle of tents and conical birch bark shelters against a dark background of trees. Flickering over the canoes drawn up on the edge of a wild rice marsh and dying redly in the black waters beyond, and throwing into the ruddy relief the high, flat plains of brown Ojibwe faces gathered around the centers of warmth and brightness. The men were a colorful lot in jeans and bright plaid shirts, but the women were dressed in somber colors. 2 young boys, the only children there, were going from fire to fire, shaking grain in shallow pans and stirring it with paddles as it parched. One man in long, soft moccasins stood in a shallow pit trampling husks, half his weight supported on a log frame. Some of the band lay back from the fires, smoking and watching idly, talking softly among themselves, while others still ate, ladling the fragrant contents of a black iron pot onto tin plates. Every now and then one of them would throw a bone back over a shoulder into the bush, and the watching animals gazed hungrily after. A woman stood at the edge of the clearing pouring grain from one bark platter to another, and the loose chaff drifted off on the slight wind like smoke. The old dog saw nothing of this, but his ears and nose supplied all that he needed to know. He could contain himself no longer and picked his way carefully down the hillside, for his shoulder still pained him. Halfway down, he sneezed violently in an eddy of chaff. One of the boys by the fire looked up at the sound, his hand closing on a stone. But the woman nearby spoke sharply, and he waited, watching intently.